I think he's a very generous person, Tony, very generous spirited.
Tony, to be honest, he could be a little bit of a bull in a china shop. I mean, I can understand why the police were a little bit wary of him.
He's very creative, he loved music, he had great ideas.
Tony Wilson was born Anthony Howard Wilson here at Hope Hospital on the 20th of February 1950. His mother Doris was in fact 46 years old when she gave birth to Tony. Her first husband had died and left her a widow until she met Sidney, Tony's father, who was an amateur actor from Hume. Sidney was a man 20 years her junior, whom she married quite soon after they met, and gave birth to Tony shortly after. Tony's grandfather Herman arrived in Salford in 1905 and had a jeweller's shop at number 238 Regent Road, Salford. Most of the original buildings along Regent Road have long since been demolished. Around here was where Herman worked, and over the course of his life in Salford he fathered 7 children, one of which, Doris, Tony's mother, opened a tobacconist's at 448 Regent Road. So it was in the early 1950s that Tony spent his childhood years living above that tobacconist's on Regent Road. Whilst continuing to own and run the tobacconist's on Regent Road in Salford, in 1955 the Wilson family moved 12 miles east to here at Ladythorne Avenue in Marple. Tony was moved to St Mary's Catholic Primary in Marple to continue his education, and in 1961 he passed his 11 plus and was placed at De La Salle Grammar in Salford, putting himself through a 35-mile round-trip commute on a daily basis.
You're aware of the 5th and 6th formers when you first start a school because they're the bullies. So Tony wasn't, because he wasn't part of the... I went to De La Salle and the rugby team ran the school, so the rugby team were the cricket team in summer, and then they were the prefects for the rest of the year. But he wasn't part of that clique, really. He was pretty academic, from what I remember.
As a child, Tony wanted to be a scientist, but his mind was changed when, aged 14, he saw a production of Hamlet starring Manchester-born David Warner in the title role over in Stratford-upon-Avon. This made a deep impression on Tony, and I think that, combined with the flamboyance of his father, which no doubt rubbed off on him, led Tony to achieve a grade A in A-level English and make the decision to read English at university. He left De La Salle with 8 O-levels and 3 A-levels. Tony spent 3 enjoyable years at Cambridge University reading English. He was involved in publishing the university paper and took his first acid tab whilst in the first year. He left in 1971 with a 2-2 in his finals.
As a person, he's quite difficult to describe. As a person, he's a lovely person. He's quite hard to work with sometimes because he's very creative. He loved music. He had great ideas. But if you disagreed with him, sometimes it could be a bit, what's the word? Especially with us, because we were so young, he could be a bit over the top and too fatherly.
After university, Tony trained as a television journalist for ITN. He worked as script editor on News at 10 and became item editor on First Report. But in 1973, he moved back home here.
To join the team at Granada Reports, which began broadcasting that year on Key Street in central Manchester.
Yeah, I saw Tony on TV, and then I had a fanzine called Debris, and I think in 84, 5, I threw a party. An issue of the fanzine came out, and I threw a party, and it was at a ballroom, like an old co-op ballroom near Plattfields, and the guy running the ballroom was the most miserable man ever, and he didn't really want these young people in his ballroom, and so we were all at the party, and Tony comes wearing his big coat, walks up the stairs, comes in, just like, what fashionably late, walks a couple of times around the room, and the miserable old man came running up to me and was like, "Is that the guy off the TV?" I'm like, "Yeah." And instantly he was like, he couldn't do enough for me, because I'd brought a TV personality into his horrible little co-op ballroom in Rusholme. I don't know if that was the first time I met Tony, but that was the first time when I realised that it wasn't just about music, that he had an aura which the wider public understood and felt. And I realised that actually that was his power. What you might call the half-interested people believed in him, because you're always going to get people who are into music, interested in music. They're going to know, yeah, New Order, they're great. But they need somebody to tell them, the half-interested people need someone to say, no, but New Order really are great. Manchester really is great. And Tony had that ability to be a bridge between the aficionados of culture, like myself maybe, and the mainstream ordinary people who were maybe a bit scared of it, or had always been into like pretty obvious stuff. But if Tony said something was good, people believed him.
I asked Factory Records photographer Kevin Cummins about his memories of Tony Wilson on Granada television.
He was the person who went on his honeymoon to San Francisco or wherever he went and came back wearing a Bruce Springsteen t-shirt and wore it on Granada Reports over his shirt and tie to present the news one night. And I remember him saying, "I've seen the future of rock and roll and it's here,"
And the fact that Tony would be on Granada News quoting W.B. Yeats or quoting James Joyce, and even just looking pretentious and having pretentious hair, all that kind of thing, I think was great, because otherwise, what do we have in Manchester? We just have that kind of no-nonsense Noel Gallagher man of the people thing, which is okay, but I love that Tony and also Paul Morley, that idea that you're given permission to be pretentious, and someone like me, naturally inclined to be that way, found that really liberating. Okay, you can read books, you can quote Irish poets, you can want to better yourself and learn and bring everybody with you, but that is not a bad thing.
Tony was a TV presenter, so to us he was that TWAT on TV, Yeah, well, he was. It seemed like a dad. He was like a dad, actually. He was on TV on the local Granada Reports programme. They still have on now, but the thing about Tony was he had a little spot. He'd convince the producers of the programme on Friday to let him have a spot where he has one live act on. And the Sex Pistols did their first TV appearance on his show. Buzzcocks did their first TV appearance, people like Iggy Pop. So if Iggy Pop was doing a gig in Manchester that night, he'd get Iggy Pop on his TV show. If the Sex Pistols were doing a gig in Manchester, he'd have them on. So whoever was playing in town, he'd get in touch with them, say, "I do a TV programme, I'm the presenter on a TV programme, can we have you on the TV programme and get loads of people at your gig?" So, and then he had his own music programme called So It Goes, And even though he was a straight-ahead TV presenter for a news programme, he'd try and convince Granada all the time to let him have music programmes or let him put music on, you know.
I've got a nice picture actually of Tony in about 1975-76 with Slaughter and the Dogs, where Tony looked so out of place, you know, as he often did, you know, but that wasn't his deal. He wasn't trying to be in any of the bands. No. He was a facilitator, and he put all the right people together. That was his great strength, knowing unlikely couplings, knowing who would work well with somebody else. Tony wouldn't go every night to gigs. I mean, I remember being at a Tom Robinson gig with him once, and I think it might have been when he was filming Tom Robinson for So It Goes, and it was at Middleton Civic.
I had a mate who was gentle and short. It was only one evening and went for a walk.
And one of the band, just before they went to soundcheck, asked Tony if he'd skin up for them. And Tony, in later years, used to make a great deal about being able to do it one-handed while he was driving. But he was sat there for ages trying to build this joint, with feeling very uncomfortable about doing it. And when the guy from the band came back, he just saw this mess on Tony's lap and took it all off him and decided it was easier to do it himself.
In the February of 1976, Tony received a package on his desk with a note. It was a New York Dolls LP without the record. The note was from Stephen Morrissey in Stratford. Mr. Wilson, I've heard about your show, it's wonderful news. Please can we have more music like this? 2 months after that, Tony received a tape in the mail containing 3 songs. The sender of the tape was Howard Trafford. The band was the Sex Pistols. Included was a note. The Sex Pistols are going to be huge. They're playing the Leicester Free Trade Hall on the 4th of June. You must see them.
So with 6 shows of So It Goes already recorded, Tony came to the Leicester Free Trade Hall to see the spectacle of the Sex Pistols. Now I'm not going to debate or speculate who actually attended these gigs, this signpost in the musical history of Manchester. To answer that question, go out and buy David Nolan's book, I Swear I Was There, The Gig That Changed the World. To find out about Tony's attendance at those gigs, I spoke to legendary rock and roll photographer Kevin Cummins, who knew Tony personally, photographed all the factory bands and actually attended the first gig himself.
Tony definitely wasn't at the first one, even though he claimed to be.
1976 was also the summer of love for Tony, as he met Lindsay Reed at that time, who moved in with him around a month after that, here at 45 Town Lane, Charlesworth. They both celebrated the occasion by taking LSD that night. Following on from the Sex Pistols gigs, So It Goes had 9 weekly shows throughout July and August of that year. It was the last show on the 28th of August, which featured the Sex Pistols. On the 9th of December 1976, Tony and Lindsay travelled to the Electric Circus in Collyhurst to see the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK tour, with the Clash and Buzzcocks also playing. One of only 3 gigs on that tour that originally had 19 gigs penciled in to take place. In the following year, 1977, was a year of change for Tony, and on the 14th of May of that year he married Lindsay here at St Mary's Church in Marple Bridge. They subsequently spent 2 weeks in California on honeymoon. Tony has said that the seeds of Factory Records were sown in that month of that year. Also in 1977, two people shared a flat here at 86 Palatine Road in West Didsbury. Charles Sturridge, who was a director at Granada and a friend of Tony's and went on to direct Brideshead Revisited, and Alan Erasmus, an out-of-work actor who saw a band called Fast Breed alive at the time and began to manage them. Alan and Tony became great friends. Consequently, this address evolved into the Factory Records offices. In January 1978, Tony and Alan decided to create and co-manage a band. The pair named their management project the Movement of the 24th of January, and the group christened the Drudgery Column. They now had a group, but needed a place to play. In the shadows of the Hume Crescents, the pair discovered the Russell Club through Alan's father, who was a frequent visitor to the West Indian Club. Through the club's leaseholder, Don Tenay, they booked 4 Friday nights in May and June of 1978, rebranding what was widely known as the Caribbean Club into the Factory Club. The 4 factory nights were promoted by an about-to-graduate graphic design student from Manchester Polytechnic called Peter Saville, who went on to become the factory in-house designer. The logical step from the Factory Club nights was to start Factory the record label, with the help of locally known record producer Martin Hannett, who went on to produce the 2 Joy Division albums. Tony used his platform at Granada TV to promote locals that he viewed as geniuses, people that needed to be seen. People like John Cooper Clarke here in 1977.
Ex-students, reformed hippies and lovers of drink, clapping and shouting for poetry. Strange, but so is John Cooper Clarke. Holding down a day job in the toolroom of Salford Tech, he also happens to be just about the brightest performing poet this side of Cassius Clay.
Thank you very much indeed.
How long have you been working here? Doing this?
3 years.
3 years?
No ambition.
It was thanks to a letter to Tony from Rob Gretton, the Joy Division manager, and the band themselves, that Tony arranged for Joy Division to make their TV debut at Granada in Manchester on the 20th of September 1978. Even when Factory Records was well underway, Tony still used Granada TV as a means of making people aware of the people he was working with outside of television. Like the genius record producer Martin Hannett, seen here with Tony in 1980 at Strawberry Recording Studios in Stockport.
I'm getting the drum sharper, is it?
Yeah.
That was the producer, and for the purposes of this film, we'll take it that the musicians have already done their job, recording their tracks, bass, drums, guitars, vocals, on a 2-inch wide magnetic tape, which records up to 24 simultaneous tracks. Now it's time for doing the mixing. What instrument on what track is first inscribed on the desk, and then it's time to start listening, beginning always with the drum tracks first.
It's got 2 completely parametric mid-ranges. You can either affect...
What's a parametric mid-range when it's at home for the weekend?
Well, it's...
In 1980, Tony moved away from Charlesworth and Lindsay and purchased a fantastic home at Old Broadway in Didsbury.
What you need in a town or a city for stuff to happen is you need somebody with a bit of power, and that bit of power might come from doing, you know, the news on the telly, or it might come from having a bit of money or whatever. Somebody with a bit of power who is prepared to open doors for other people, to enable other people to contribute and to function and to make some kind of cultural difference. So you need an enabler, but also what you need is somebody who will then be able to shape all that activity and define it and go out and tell people about it. And Tony was both. Tony was somebody who would give people an opportunity, sign a band, give them full reign. DJ like myself, I got my first gigs at the Hacienda. No one told me what to play. You know, people always think, oh, well, Tony, yeah, he knew his music. I never had one conversation with Tony about music policy in 450 evenings of DJing at the Hacienda, apart from one night when he asked me if we played reggae, and I told him that we didn't.
The Beatles have been from Manchester, and they've made a lot of money out of a scene that came out of Manchester and then have pissed off to London and spent it all in Savile Row building Apple down there. They won't be very popular here. In Liverpool, everyone thinks that's great. You know, yeah, you make it, you go to London. And I think the difference it makes to Manchester, 10cc, for example, they make a load of cash. They built Strawberry Studios in the early 70s, so that when we come, Factory comes on stream as a record company, we have an international recording facility just around the corner from us. Similarly, then New Order make a whole pile of money, and they're able to, together with other people, they're able to build the Hacienda, which is so vital to what's happened in the second half of the 80s in this town. More recently, to build Dry, the bar, so people have a bar they can go to.
How would you like to go to New York to record your first album? So we went, yeah, all right then. So he said, you'll all have to leave your jobs, because we were all working, and because we're going there for 6 weeks. So we went to New York and recorded our first proper album in East Orange in New Jersey. And he took us to New York. I've just been to New York, actually, and every time I go to New York, which is every couple of years, all I think about is Tony, because he took us there for 6 weeks the first time, 6 weeks the second time, and we stayed in lofts in Tribeca, and he used to harp on about lofts, and he used to say, see all this space here that nobody wants. He says, this is going to be huge in 10 years' time. All these lofts will be well sought after.
After the death of Ian Curtis and the continuation of the band under the name New Order, Tony Wilson and Rob Gretton came up with the idea of opening a club. Inspired by visits to New York to places like the Danceteria, Hurrah, Funhouse and the Loft, it was agreed that the label would pay £35,000 and New Order would contribute £35,000, which would be tax deductible, to build the Hacienda.
They began searching Manchester for premises and found an old yacht warehouse here, which became known as the Hacienda when it opened on the 21st of May 1982.
He used to love New York, and we were so lucky going there with him. If we hadn't have gone there with Tony, I wouldn't know so much about New York and be connected so much to it.
I think he was a very generous person, Tony, and very generous-spirited. And I think he gave up a lot of himself for Manchester to have what it had. He firmly believed in what he was doing, even though it would hemorrhage money.
Yeah.
He liked Malcolm McLaren a lot, and he liked what Malcolm had done. And he liked that whole situationist movement, that idea of various things you could do and various ways that you could manipulate people and so on. I think he was quite interested in all that. And I think Tony was probably more interested in the way he could create something than actually the creative process. He wasn't that interested in sitting in a recording studio pressing buttons and seeing what they did. He was more interested in putting Martin Hannett with Happy Mondays, or me with Happy Mondays, or Malcolm Garrett with someone, and people to see how they worked together and just see what came out of it. That was his main interest from all that. I don't think he had a massive interest in how you made a record. He didn't care.
The dynamic between Tony and the people he enabled, you know, the bands he signed, the people he gave jobs to, the people who worked at the Hacienda, it was a weird dynamic because he would give you that opportunity and he wouldn't really get involved. You know, as Joy Division New Order would say, he was very, very hands-off. Partly because he didn't actually know, it sounds awful, but he didn't know that much about music in the way that you could. he wasn't like me where I'd have a conversation about the B-side instrumental of this import from Detroit that was on a small label called KMS, and I was hanging out with people who'd have an opinion on that B-side, but Tony wouldn't have a clue about all that because he was much more big picture person, you know. So he'd let all us little whatever music bods and bands and DJs get on with our thing. But then the weird thing that then happened was that he sometimes wouldn't, kind of rightly, he wouldn't be able to stop himself from taking credit from what those people achieved. So then there became a weird dynamic where he'd then go and tell people about how great New Order were and kind of front the whole operation, factory, the Hacienda. And we'd all be slightly disconcerted because we'd be thinking, well, he hardly ever comes in the Hacienda and he doesn't know anything about the music we play. And yet he's on TV talking about the revolution that's happening at the Hacienda, you know. And that was that kind of, it was like a little bit of a weird dynamic.
We knew each other socially anyway because we lived near to each other. You know, I shot Joy Division. I use the term bought loosely. They had some pictures from me. And I think really it was, and I'd shot everybody on Factory. And then when he got excited about the Mondays, he said to me, I've just got this band, you'll really like them. They're from Salford. And I said, and you know, because I'd lived in Salford, Tony was from Salford, so we had that connection, went to school in Salford. So he took me to meet the Mondays, and he introduced his usual expansive self, and he's saying to them, right, introduced me to the band. He said, this is Kevin Cummins. He's photographed the Sex Pistols, Joy Division, he's photographed Mark Bolan, and before he could say anything else, Sean said, they're all fucking dead. I said, what would you like to do? And they said, we want our picture taken with Rambo. But Tony, thinking he meant Rambo, the French poet, starts talking about, I didn't know you were into that kind of thing, Sean, and starts talking expansively about Rambo. And he said, no, you daft cunt, there's a poster of him across the road from the Hacienda.
Then began an era of some fantastic band performances at the Hacienda, with gigs by New Order or the Smiths usually selling out. But opening the club 6 days and 6 nights a week, combined with bad management, meant that the club was just hemorrhaging money every month. The club was simply too empty for too many nights of the year. In January 1984, segments of new Channel 4 music show The Tube were broadcast live from the Hacienda, including a performance from new American singer Madonna with her single Holiday. Not long after the Tube broadcast, Tony met a young woman by the name of Hilary Sherlock, the former girlfriend of Howard Kingston, who was the lead singer of Manchester prog rockers Gentlemen, who had starred in a 1976 broadcast of So It Goes. The pair were soon married. They married in New York and honeymooned in Mexico. And on their return, Hilary announced she was pregnant with Oliver.
I think one of the things about Tony, though, was that which I took from him was, first of all, that idea of being different. I mean, I remember the Face magazine coming to the Hacienda and reviewing it in about 1985 or 6. And they interviewed people out on the street afterwards. And there was somebody who hadn't been at to the Hacienda, and the magazine said, why don't you go to the Hacienda? And this person said, I don't like the music, they're trying to educate us. Now, for me, that was exactly why I was involved in the Hacienda. I loved that idea and that process. That's what it was all about. And that idea that you're different and you go out on a limb and you believe in what you're doing and you try and bring everyone with you. I think that was always the factory way, and I think that was really important.
In late 1986, Tony began presenting a late-night open-ended discussion show called After Dark, which was broadcast nationally. For the After Dark show, and subsequently beyond that, Tony became known as Anthony H. Wilson. In the late 1980s, Tony began to present a new Granada television show called The Other Side of Midnight, notably including performances by The Fall, The Stone Roses, and Happy Mondays. When the popularity of Mike Pickering's DJ nights began to overtake the popularity of gigs from bands put on at the Hacienda in the latter part of 1986, the seeds of the second summer of love were sown. In fact, at the beginning of 1987, the Hacienda had 3 regular club nights: Temperance on Thursdays, Nude on Fridays, and Wide on Saturdays. This, I don't doubt, led to the huge cultural explosion known as Manchester throughout 1989 and 1990.
These guys are Bailey brothers who were doing videos for the Mondays, and they were talking about maybe doing a little project or a little story, and they wanted to do it on a twist on the Isle of Man. And Tony was at that meeting and went away, and the next Happy Mondays EP was the Manchester EP, and so that was kind of how he worked in terms of selling it as well, giving it a label and giving it and making it feel like it had that impact. So we did both that enabling and that evangelising about what happened in Manchester, and that's kind of why he was so important.
Back at Granada, Tony was asked by his colleague Mike Spencer if he wouldn't mind showing a journalist/presenter, former Miss UK, Yvette Livesey, around the newsroom at Granada. Also around this time, Tony and Hilary's second child Isabel was born, whilst the relationship with Yvette was kept hidden and remained secret for 2 years. In early 1991, with the Hacienda closing its doors briefly over problems of door control and guns and gangsters, Tony and Yvette moved in together into a rented cottage near Northwich and then onto Barrow Bridge near Bolton.
Tony used to come out with all this stuff about how it was certain types of music that rescued it, and the Acid House thing clearly did rescue things, and it became the best club in the world for maybe 2 years. But Mike Pickering always says the thing that saved the Hacienda was when we did Stella for £1 nights.
The remainder of the 1990s saw the Hacienda beset with problems of bad management, violence and guns, the tabloid press terming this city Gunchester at the time.
It wasn't making any money. People weren't being honest. People were nicking off the company, if you like. You'd see people, Pete Hook says this in his book, when it closed at night, there'd be people carrying crates of beer out. I mean, they'd pay for them, but, you know, the business just wasn't running right. It wasn't a proper business. So I think he probably was glad to get rid of that worry, you know. So I think probably both Rob and Tony thought that it served its purpose, it's done its time, let's get out while the going's good, you know.
In the July of 1991, Tony and Yvette flew to New York to launch the In the City event, which became a great success for many years to follow. Due to his heavy drinking and drug use, Martin Hannett's career spiralled into decline. And on the 18th of April 1991, weighing in at 26 stone by this time, Martin Hannett died of heart failure. He was only 42 years old.
Tony, to be honest, he could be a little bit of a bull in a china shop. I mean, I can understand why the police were a little bit wary of him, because part of Tony's makeup was a kind of hippie rebel, and the police weren't, him and Rob Gretton, who was the same in a way, police weren't natural allies. You know what I mean? They'd grown up not really trusting the police. And as a consequence, the police didn't really trust the Hacienda. The council were. I mean, the council understood that the Hacienda was bringing in profile and bringing in people, and that it was a really valuable part of Manchester. The council understood that, but the police, you know, your average policeman wants an easy life. And if there's a club with 1,500 people in, with another 1,000 trying to get in on a Friday and a Saturday night, where there are known drug dealers and all kinds of hassle going on, the police would rather shut it down.
So in 1997, it was no surprise to anybody that the Hacienda finally closed its doors for good.
Sometimes you could see him wearing different hats like we all do, but you could see him kind of moving between all these worlds, and I think it was, you know, kind of quite difficult in a way. Now, being a bit older, I kind of realise that that's actually quite hard to do. Tony's personality was that he did fall out with people. You know, he wasn't a great team player. Infamously fell out with Martin Hannett. You know, Hannett was a founder director of Factory, had produced the Joy Division albums, and they had a massive falling out, and Hannett, you know, wanted to shoot him basically.
Trying to talk to that fucking one-way mirror that is the chairman of the board.
Who's Tony?
Yeah, Tony.
He had a very difficult relationship with Rob Gretton. You know, you never quite knew if they were speaking, and they weren't always. Especially around the time when Factory went bankrupt in '92. The next couple of years was quite difficult with New Order, because I think they kind of fell out with Tony a bit, because they wanted to sign to London Records in London, and Tony wanted them to kind of help him rebuild Factory 2. He fell out with a load of people. I mean, he fell out with me at least 3 times. And he fell out with Paul Morley, the journalist.
He was also heavily involved with the council, and if he disagreed with things that the Labour Council were doing at the time, he'd arrange meetings with the leaders of the council and go and influence them, you know, because he felt that even though he's from Salford, he feels that Manchester is his city, and because he had an influence, he would try and influence decisions, you know.
He was a visionary. Tony was a visionary, and he could envisage what should happen and what needed to happen. And then if someone got in the way of that vision, whether it was a music producer or his partner at Factory or some DJ at the Hacienda like myself, if somebody was in the way, he would feel antagonised by that person standing in the way of his vision. And he actually, at those points, he wasn't as affable as he used to give out in terms of his character. He could be kind of quite hard and quite determined.
New Order and the label sold the building for £1.2 million minus costs. 2 years later it was sold on for £5 million, and then sold on again at double that to the company that turned the site into the Hacienda Apartments.
You know, again, it's kind of weird being that kind of person, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. A lot of the establishment, if you like the BBC, the police, they didn't trust Tony. They thought he was, you know, a bit flaky and up to no good. But the people who were properly flaky and up to no good all thought Tony was a member of the establishment.
Yeah, I saw him a few times. I saw him at South by Southwest in Austin, and at the in the cities thing. Still working, still doing presentations. I mean, that was earlier on in his illness. Later on in his illness, I didn't see him because, you know, he was obviously too ill.
Well, I think there's a massive, for me, I don't live in Manchester anymore, obviously, but I think there's a massive, massive hole in Manchester since Tony died, and several people have tried to fill it, and they're not big enough to fill it. I think, you know, Tony was a weird mixture, really. He was very self-deprecating in one way, and in another way, he was very arrogant. So he was quite happy to tell you his band were the best band in the world ever. He made some outlandish statements about Joy Division, for instance, and about Ian's death being a great rock and roll moment, and stuff that was quite ill-advised, you know. But I think his heart was in the right place. He wanted Manchester. He wanted to promote Manchester and promote Manchester as a great musical city, and that's what he did. And I think the legacy is here for everyone to enjoy. You walk around Manchester and it's a music city.
It was Dave Haslam that quoted, "We should perhaps remember Tony Wilson in some way for what he's given to Manchester."
Yeah, I was quoted recently as saying that I thought Whitworth Street should be renamed Anthony Wilson Way, because we are all walking the Anthony Wilson Way, talking the Anthony Wilson Way.
And it was decided that the first street development here was where we would remember him, with a Tony Wilson Square. This to me is the perfect location, because everything that Tony's brought to Manchester and given to Manchester, and that I've enjoyed about Manchester, can be found within spitting distance of this location.
A lot of the students come here because it's Manchester and because of its music scene. Well, that wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Tony.
Just to the right of me used to stand the Hacienda. Just on the other side of the road is the City Road Inn, where we used to go before we went to the Hacienda. Just down Little Peter Street there is where a lot of Manchester bands used to rehearse at TJ Davidson's, Buzzcocks, Joy Division, even Oasis rehearsed down there in the spring, summer of 1992 in perfecting their sound. So this to me is the perfect location to remember Tony Wilson. And indeed, when we come down here in the spring of 2015, we will be walking through the Tony Wilson Square.
As an influence on Manchester, Manchester wouldn't be the city that it is without him.
But yeah, he doesn't need, his legacy's here. His legacy's this pub, his legacy's across the road in another bar. That's his legacy. You don't need a street named after him. I like the idea that something square is named after him. In the old 60s style, meaning of the word, you know, that's quite good. But no, you don't need that. You walk into Manchester, you get off the train in Manchester and you're in a musical city. And his legacy is all over the city. It's not just one square that someone's going to piss in on a Friday night.
He had such an influence on the city musically by starting off his label, which he just wanted to put out music that he loved. I think what people need to appreciate who don't know him is that this city that they're living in or visiting now wouldn't be the same without him. When they go into a bar, that bar possibly wouldn't have been like that without Dry Bar,
Yeah.
When they go to a club, it possibly wouldn't have been like that without the influence of the Hacienda. And that influence has spread out of this city into the rest of the UK and into the rest of the world. Because anywhere you go in the world, anyone who's seriously into dance music, if you mention the Hacienda, they know what you're talking about straight away. If he was still in Manchester, if he was still alive now, I think he'd be involved a lot more with the council, and I think he'd be getting more into politics and trying to, as he got older, I think maybe he would try and have a bit more influence on things like the Manchester International Festival, developments in the city. Saying what you're doing, putting up that shit-looking building up there for, you're destroying our city. Or I think he'd try and still carry on having an influence, but in different ways, not in a musical way.
In a way, for me, it's all a bit irrelevant because it's all these things, factory, the Hacienda, Tony's life and career is all about sowing seeds, and it's all about what did people who experienced that, what did they take from that experience and what did they go on and do? And that is really the legacy.